as if the NRA couldn't get any worse. They're now actually arguing to the Supreme Court that laws preventing accused domestic abusers from owning guns are unconstitutional. Now, this case is USA versus Zackey Rahimi. Now, Rahimi was involved in a series of shooting incidents, including one in which he fired at a bystander who saw him assaulting his girlfriend. Now, the girlfriend obtained a protective order against him, and when he was arrested for other crimes, he was also charged with violating a federal law prohibiting those under domestic violence restraining orders from possessing guns. Now, there is no doubt that overturning these laws would harm and kill women. From WAPO, more than half of female homicide victims are killed by current or former intimate partners. Every month, about 70 American women are shot and killed this way. One meta-analysis of 17 separate studies found that male domestic abusers who had access to guns were 11 times more likely than abusers without access to guns to kill their victims. It is the number one indicator that domestic abuse will turn deadly, is whether or not the abuser has access to a gun. Now, the NRA argues, however, that gun owners should not be stripped of their Second Amendment rights without first being convicted of a crime with a high standard of evidence. A group of 9 gun rights act groups, argued in the Supreme Court and filed. It said this: the government desires the power to disarm untold thousands of Americans subject to civil protective orders, which are based on all manner of material or relational discord. Now, Congress made it a felony to possess a firearm while subject to protective order for domestic violence in 1996. The law survived constitutional challenges for nearly 3 decades. Now, this new right-wing Supreme Court bench that we all know and love has switched things up. The decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. versus Bruin, penned by Justice Clarence Thomas, everybody's favorite Supreme Court justice, said that neither state nor federal government could weigh public safety concerns anymore when considering the constitutionality of firearm restrictions. Instead, courts would have to judge whether a given gun restriction had a historical tradition dating back to some time between 1791, and the end of the Civil War, which is absolutely patently absurd and isn't based on any previous legal theories. It is something that Clarence Thomas made up out of thin air. Completely fabricated BS. And of course, in the United States of America, we didn't have exactly strong protections for women or strong protections against violence against women pre-Civil War. Let's just I'm very frustrated, but I do want to get a little bit more facts to you all. Now, the coalition is hoping to use the new Bruin parameters to their advantage. Wrote this: government seeks to turn Americans who have never committed a felony into felons based on their mere act of possessing a firearm, and claims to justify this with historically unsupported rationales. Now, the NRA quite literally wants to set women back 2 centuries. We didn't have restraining orders that took guns away from anyone in the 1700s and 1800s. While there were some laws punishing men for beating their wives and children, none involved confiscating guns. So it's very hard to say the domestic abuser ban is consistent with the history and tradition of American gun regulation. And that is a statement from Adam Winkler of UCLA Law. Now, Rahimi's case is the first that the Supreme Court will take since issuing the landmark ruling last year. And Jackson, this is just comically evil to argue that people who have protective orders against them for domestic violence should be allowed to have guns, which I said again, the number one indicator that they will kill their domestic partner is whether or not they have access to a gun. It's despicable.
Yeah, and it's not even like you said, there's a half, 2 times, 3 times as likely, it's 11 times as likely to happen. Yeah. So much to the point where there's really just a lot of, hatred towards women, a culture of it, like, who cares, whatever. It's just an easy scapegoat. But another important thing is, if you're talking about before the Civil War, there's, firearms have become so much more sophisticated and so much more deadly. And there's so much more variety now than there was back then. So much to the point where there's quite a bit more firearms than there are human beings in this country. But, the NRA and just the gun culture in this country is a good example of when you become overly rigid. I mean, what are you really selling at this point? There's no room for, 11 times more likely to use it and kill somebody who's already in a physically disadvantaged situation. It's just callous. As you pointed out, it's evil, it's callous, and purposeful, very purposeful. What other areas can we find where we can just increase access to weapons? That's all it is.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of hope that obviously Justices Clarence and Alito are going to side with Rahimi's argument in this case. We already know that. There's a lot of hope that the other conservative justices will stop short of allowing violent domestic abusers to have guns, but we'll have to see how this plays out. They're going to be hearing the arguments in the coming weeks, and the decision is not expected for several months after that.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.